The three-act story is the most common way to see stories discussed. Introduction, rising action, and resolution. It is ubiquitous in Western storytelling. But there's more storytelling than just Western storytelling. Today I'm going to give you a primer on what the three-act story structure is, why nearly every story you love fits this mold, the Eastern alternatives, and when you should deviate from the three-act structure. Welcome to the Writing Theory Podcast, a podcast for every level of writer. Everything that we discuss here on this podcast is about pushing you to the next level of storytelling. From prose to structure to the business of writing, you can join me every Wednesday for a new episode, a new topic, and a new takeaway that you can apply to your writing right away. I'm Carson Long. Let's get started. All right, the three-act structure, a name you've probably heard of before and one that you're probably at least pretty familiar with. The three-act structure is like the dominant storytelling format in the Western world, especially in modern stories and screenwriting, the movies that you are watching today. Now, that being said, the three-act structure is mostly a way of kind of comprehending stories, of speaking about stories, of being able to understand and analyze them. It's not necessarily something like a plot framework, like a Save the Cat kind of plot framework. If it was, it's a pretty crappy plot framework. I kind of equate it a lot of times to this sort of idea of Freytag's pyramid. And I can't put up a cool little graphic for you like on a video. But Freytag's pyramid is this super rudimentary kind of expression of story. The introduction, the rising action, the climax, the resolution. Maybe there's also an inciting incident in there, but this is the kind of thing that you're exposed to in sort of your first education of storytelling, whether that was back in elementary school or maybe your education system was different, you figured it out at another point in time. But that's like the introductory idea for what a story is. And the three-act structure, very similar. So let's do a quick breakdown of what this three-act structure is and why it's important to you. And this sort of lays the groundwork for what we're about to talk about next. So first and foremost, three acts, right? Easy to understand. Act one, the introduction, the setup. Let's show the readers what the world is like and who our characters are and what the major conflict's going to be. This is everything from your introduction to your inciting incident, sort of to your characters now being out on the quest. If you can imagine, the hero's journey follows a very similar sort of opening act. What's the opening image? What's life like? Establish the status quo. Now mix it up, have an inciting incident, send that hero out on their quest. That is your Act 1 setup. Conventional wisdom will tell you this is like the first 25% of your story in total word counts. To me, this is the easiest and most fun part of the story to plan, the story to write. It's the part of storytelling that you also get to practice most often, because how many stories do you start but not finish? Does that make sense? We don't get a lot of practice in creating the resolution and the final confrontation of our stories, but we do get a lot of practice with Act 1. Act 2 is the confrontation, is sort of what you would maybe see it kind of said as. I've also seen it said as rising action. I've also just heard it be called the middle of the story. Act 2 is 50% of your total word count. It's the bulk of the story. It's rising tension. It's the complications that your characters are going to have, but it's also the development of them and the relationships that they have. It's the point of no return where your heroes can just no longer walk away from the situation. And it's every single moment where the stakes are raised. Act 2, to be honest, Act 2 is kind of your story. I know that sounds weird. Let me explain. So first, I want to say Act 2 of the 3-act structure does a lot of heavy lifting. You heard me say that it's rising tension, it's complications, it's character development. Act 2 is 50% of your whole story, and it's everything that happens before the climax. And when you think about that, that's insane, right? That we're just summarizing this as Act 2. But notoriously, a lot of stories that newer authors are writing specifically are going to falter in Act 2. Because this is where, you're past your inciting incident. Now your characters can kind of do anything. And you have a lot of ground to cover before you get to that Act 3. I love when I'm talking about sort of Act 2 of a story, I love to use the Goblet of Fire, the Harry Potter book, as sort of the example of a great second act. And I'll tell you exactly why. So first off, guilty pleasure. This is like the formula of having a tournament in a story is one of my favorites. I just think it's so fun. It naturally lends itself to like conflict and betrayals and alliances and moments of like, the dark night of the soul. We're losing. What are we going to do? In the Goblet of Fire, we have these multiple rounds of a tournament that Harry Potter is in. And there are very clear stakes, but also through the progression of the story, as all of these challenges that Harry and his other contestants are going through, things get progressively more dangerous for them. And this is an important part of the second act of a story, because the goal of the second act is, of course, to move the plot forward, but also to keep raising the stakes. The first challenge that all the contestants go through for this Goblet of Fire tournament, my memory's a little hazy on the whole thing, is a challenge. That's good. That's what the tournament's all about. But as the story progresses and as it becomes clear that there's something more happening behind the scenes, now every single challenge of this tournament has an extra layer of danger because we know Harry is in danger. This is what the second act needs to do. First, once your story gets to the second act, there needs to be a reason why your character can't just turn around and go home and forget about it, right? Frodo and Sam can't just be like, you know what? Carrying this ring to Mordor, kind of a tough job, kind of a tall ask. I have to take 3 steps for every single step that Gandalf takes. That is a big order. They can't turn around because they can't give up. They can't go back home because they've crossed the point of no return. If they don't do what they need to do, evil will win, right? That needs to happen in your second act. And then as time goes on, like with the Goblet of Fire, we want there to be multiple conflicts that keep raising the stakes and that keep continuing to be points of no return. That's a lot of stuff that you have to do for an Act 2. And then that finally leads us to Act 3, the resolution. This is also the climax and the aftermath and everything that we've been building up to. Act 3 is, in this sort of traditional wisdom of the 3-act structure, supposed to be the final 25% of your story. Now, I say that because that's actually really important. I have a video coming out next week. It's called Nailing the Ending. And in that video, I talk about the sort of common pitfalls you might see in stories where the ending doesn't quite feel right. And how do we avoid that? How do we overcome that? And how do you make sure that your ending to your story is worth the rest of the journey? And one of the examples I use here is a story that's a thick book, 800 something pages long. And everything's building up to this big bad guy coming out of the earth and is going to take over the world. He's the evil bad guy, like every other big fantasy story. But the thing is, of this 800-page book, that final climax and all of the resolution that takes place after that big battle happens in the last 30 pages. And that may not sound crazy, but we're talking about an 800-page book, which in this case means that the climax and the resolution, which is basically the Act 3 of this book, takes place in the last 3% of the story, which is simply not enough time for how much we've been building towards the end. Check out the video on YouTube if you're listening to this and it's not April 23rd. the video should be out already. So here's something tricky here. I told you that Act 2 was the hardest part of your story, but you might naturally think, isn't crafting the ending of your story the hardest part? And my answer to you is, I don't think so. The ending of your story, and this was how it was phrased by William Zinsser in the writing book On Writing Well, which is mostly a prose book, but William Zinsser wrote specifically about the ending of stories, and they phrased it perfectly. I'm going to say it exactly like he said it. The ending of your story should make sense, make total sense, but leave the reader surprised. And I say that because by the time you're getting to Act 3 in your story, I think there's almost always kind of a natural conclusion. And this is something I discovered in writing my Starlight Farms Kennel for Talking Dogs novella, was this idea that like I'm halfway through writing this story. Well, of course, this is how the story is going to end. Of course, this is the big challenge that we're going to face. Of course, this would fit the theme. And I think that happens a lot when it comes to the ending of your story. You, as the author, spend so much time building that story up to the end. By the time you get there, you kind of know what needs to happen. So Act 3 is the climax, it's the aftermath and the resolution. The conflicts are resolved. The themes that you've established earlier in the novel kind of come full circle, and everything should build up to this conclusion, which makes it sound like this should be the most important thing. And it kind of, like, I get it. Here's the thing. Of course, the ending is important. But like, if you lose your reader in Act 2, they'll never get to experience that ending. And you want your ending to be good because it's going to be the last thing that your reader remembers about the book. They're not going to remember what was happening at the beginning of Act 2. They're going to remember that big climactic scene right at the end of the story and how everything resolved for the characters. So of course, Act 3 is important. And look, if you go through and everything builds to the climax and it has this cool resolution and everyone's happy and there's a big payoff, you can even get extra bonus points. And I love when stories do this. If the climax and the resolution of the story can somehow mirror the introduction of the story somehow. Whether that's a theme, whether your character returns back home and they're changed in some way, in some sort of way, if you can make these two things relate to each other, if you can make them mirror each other, that is like the cherry on top of the banana split. That is the dream. So basically, that is the 3-act structure. That's kind of all you need to know. There's maybe some further discussion you can have about it, but in reality, those are all the important bits. So maybe the first question here is, why should you even care? It's not like the 3-act structure helps you put together a plot. Like I said, if it was a plot framework, it would kind of stink. But I do think there are some good kind of takeaways you can use a 3-act structure for. And for me personally, kind of structuring my story based on those percentage values I shared with you is how I use a 3-act structure. If I'm planning on writing a story that is 100,000 words, I'm going to allow myself to spend 25% of that, 25,000 words, on the introduction and introducing the characters and building the theme and having the inciting incident and kicking our characters off on the quest. And then I'm going to allow myself 50,000 words to do all the middle stuff, right? And I'm going to make sure that the ending of my story feels earned and like it has enough time dedicated to it by using that last 25,000 words. Outside of that, with the 3-act structure, I don't think I personally use it in any other way. But this is a way you can look at pretty much every story in sort of Western modern storytelling, which begs the question, are there alternatives? So let me tell you about Kisho Tenketsu, which I don't know if you can tell this. This is a word that is not normally in my lexicon. So Kisho Tenketsu is the idea of a kind of a different style of story that has been present in Eastern storytelling for a long time. And by Eastern storytelling, I mean Japanese, Chinese kind of traditional stories. I'm not saying every story from these countries follows this. I'm not saying they don't also use the 3-act structure, but there are some very clear examples of a story being told not for the same purposes as a 3-act story. So let me tell you what Kisho Tenketsu is. Oh man. Yeah, get in the comments if you hate how I pronounce this. So Kisho Tenketsu is a 4-part structure, starting with ki, and then sho, and then ten, and then ketsu. So let me break it down. Ki is the introduction. Similar to what we had before at the beginning of the 3-act structure, this is the setup of the characters and the setting. Who's gonna be in our story? Where are they existing? What's this world like? What are we getting into? Sho is the next stage of the story, and this is sort of development of the situation, right? This is us now meeting potentially additional characters that are going to help move the plot along, but maybe not main characters. This is us exploring new locations. This is us gathering, as readers, gathering new information that's going to be used within the story. Following that, we have ten, which is the twist, an unexpected turn, or some sort of contrasting juxtaposition that the story now has. And maybe this is introducing a new concept that we weren't expecting. That's the unexpected turn. Or a sudden loss of something that we already had. And now we can see things differently because there's this contrast or this juxtaposition. That's 10, the twist. And then finally, we have Ketsu, Kisho Tenketsu. Ketsu is the conclusion. But instead of the conclusion of the story being a big climactic showdown, like you would see in Lord of the Rings or a Harry Potter movie, Ketsu is the conclusion of the story and kind of wrapping everything up. It's not a big final showdown. It's not everything building to Ketsu, this moment of conclusion. And that's one of the big differences between a 3-act story and Kisho Tenketsu. A 3-act story is always building to that climactic ending. And Kisho Tenketsu, not so much. There may not even be a big central conflict. And that's one of the key differences. So unlike Western narratives, it's not about the big climax. And to kind of give you a Western equivalent to Kisho Tenketsu, oh my God, it's going to be the death of me. I'm going to talk about the classic mystery novel. Now, this is not a murder mystery, not a big thriller, but something like Encyclopedia Brown, if you read that growing up, or Agatha Christie. All right, so let me sort of paint you a picture. In these kind of mystery stories, we are introduced to the characters and a mystery that needs to be solved. That is key, the introduction. Then we meet the potential suspects and we find some clues. That's the expansion of the situation. That's show, the development. Following that, there's a twist as we piece the clues together and our detective points out the killer. Now note, this is not Scooby-Doo where we are chasing down someone in a costume and unmasking them. This is, imagine the movie Clue, right? If you ever saw that with Tim Curry, where all the pieces have been put together and now we're solving the mystery and everything's making sense. And then we say it was the butler, right? That's the idea of the twist, right? The unexpected turn. We finally figure out who did it. It's not a confrontation. It's not a thriller novel where we say this person was the killer. Now they're trying to kill you. It's not like that. It's simply the surprising answer to our problems. And then, of course, we need the resolution to the story and to sort of wrap things up in a nice little bow. And while I don't know if I would be so brazen as to say these mystery novels, maybe even like Sherlock Holmes, are Kisho Tenketsu, I would say that they have some similarities. The primary thing being that you're not reading that story because there's some major central conflict that's going to culminate in one big final climax to the story. This type of story structure is used to tell a different kind of story. A 3-act story tends to excel at presenting the external plot. Here is our character that's in a bad situation. Here's all the steps they take trying to overcome that situation. Here's the climactic final confrontation before life is chill again. But Kisho Tenketsu isn't like that. In fact, this is a kind of story that especially is good for telling stories that explore more introspective topics. I imagine, as someone who is not huge into manga or anime, that a slice of life kind of story is more likely to fit into this box than the 3-act structure. So what does this mean to you? Well, just like the 3-act structure, it's not necessarily a plot framework for you to follow, but a way for you to look at stories in a different way. And if you wanted to, you could kind of use the same, organization and like maybe percentage values that I talked about with the 3-act structure. You could use this as a guiding principle for planning your next story. And it's just a different kind of story to tell. One thing when I was doing research for this episode that I thought was really interesting is that there's a link in the show notes that you can click on for just a very short article that I found while researching this. But they referenced a poem that kind of exemplifies what Kisho Tenketsu is. And I'll read you that poem. And this is a 4-line poem, 1 for Ki, 1 for Sho, 1 for Ten, 1 for Ketsu. So remember, this is introduction, expansion, a twist, and then a conclusion, typically that relates back to that twist. So introduction, daughters of Atoya in the Honmachi of Osaka. Oh, brutal. Expansion. The elder daughter is 16 and the younger one is 14. That's more information. The twist. Throughout history, generals killed the enemy with bows and arrows. The conclusion relating to the twist. The daughters of Atoya kill with their eyes. You see how it related to the previous line. And I think this is just a cool visualization, I guess for lack of a better word, of a story structure, a 4-line poem that kind of represents the idea of what we're currently talking about. And I would love to see someone put together a 3-act structure version of this. I don't know. I just thought it was cool. All right, so we've gone over the 3-act structure, why you would use it, sort of what it's good at. And we've gone over Kisho Tenketsu, which is a different way to approach storytelling for a different end result than the 3-act structure. So now, if you're like me, you are most likely, if you're going to tell a story, it's going to be in the 3-act structure. That's how I've experienced stories my whole life. That's how I'm going to tell my story. So the question is, now that we know the rules, the framework, the reason behind the 3-act structure, can we choose to ditch the 3-act structure? And why would we do that? Well, there's a certain thing I think that the 3-act structure is really not good at. I said that the 3-act structure is great for external plots. Here's the series of events that happen as we lead up to the big climactic showdown. But I don't think the 3-act structure is necessarily good for more introspective stories. If your story is about exploring a character or exploring a dilemma or exploring the emotional journey of a set of characters or a romance, that's not something that necessarily has to follow the 3-act structure. And in fact, you could argue there's beneficial reasons to ditch that 3-act structure. Additionally, I think we see a lot of stories in a modern setting here that choose to tell their stories non-linearly, whether that is multiple timelines, whether that is different perspectives. You could even go as goofy as to say this is going to be a story that has time travel. Now, does that mean you have to break the mold of the 3-act structure? What does the 3-act structure mean if you're hopping back and forth non-linearly? Now, personally, I think you could take this as I'm going to tell a story that doesn't fit the 3-act structure, and this is why. But I also think you can look at this from a reader's experience, and I think a lot of times it's beneficial to still build your stories with the 3-act in mind. But technically, you could say I'm not going to do the 3-act structure because I want to present something more non-linearly. For example, maybe you want to have the big conflict and climax happen early in your story, and then through telling the story non-linearly, we start to learn information that changes the way that we experience that climax earlier on. And that's the experience you want to build for your readers. First off, that sounds super cool, right? I love that. If you've ever heard of a story that does that, let me know, because that would be a great story to study. And I kind of just pulled that example out of thin air, but I bet there's something out there that at least attempts that. So let me know in the comments. So why would you break the 3-act structure? Well, it's art, right? And I have this conversation a lot, which is the idea of, can you put rules on art like writing? Because some people would say, God, no, it's art. Art is abstract, subjective. You can create something that someone loves and someone else despises. You can create something, and even if it doesn't fit the mold of the status quo, it's still art that you've created. I get that. But if you want to create art that is commercially successful, following a lot of these same rules that are just simply kind of in place for modern storytelling, they would say to use the 3-act structure. I would say you can break those rules, but you should do it with intention. You should know and have a good reason for why you're choosing to subvert certain expectations, whether it's the 3-act structure or whether it's a trope within your genre, or whether it's that ambiguous ending that you want to write. Yes, readers want resolution, but if you do it well and if you have intention, you can choose to not give them resolution, and that is totally okay. And lastly, why would you subvert the 3-act structure? Because every story is different, and who knows that story better than you? And if you are making this story and there's something inside that story that's telling you, no, do something different, you need to follow that story. That's a big moment. You need to trust your own intrinsic storytelling instincts, because they may say the 3-act structure, not right for this. That happens to me all the time with plot frameworks. Oh, I love Save the Cat, but this story doesn't quite fit Save the Cat. Oh, I love Dan Harmon's Story Circle. I've used it in the past. I find it works with my brain really well, but for this story, it's not the right answer. That could be the same thing for the 3-act structure. And that's kind of what it all comes down to. The 3-act structure, it isn't really a rule about writing. There's very few rules about writing, but it is a tool. And it's a tool that most of the time is applicable and smart to use. Sometimes it's perfect. This is exactly how your story should be organized. Other times, you might have a story where Kisho Tenketsu would serve you better because the object and the goal of your story doesn't quite fit with that 3-act structure, and that's not a bad thing. Master structure so you can decide how you want to subvert it. Let form enhance what you want to write, but don't let it constrain you. Does that make sense? If you like thinking about stories like this and at least trying to explore and kind of push the boundaries of what you want to know about stories, what you want to learn, and how you can use them in your stories today, then follow this podcast, whether you found it on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I would love to see your comments below on what you think. Do you love the 3-act structure? Do you hate it? Are you a Freytag's Pyramid fanboy? Are you a Dan Harmon's Story Circle fangirl? Who knows? Are you a Kisho Tenketsu lover? Am I even pronouncing Kisho Tenketsu correctly? I'm doing my best. You can find new podcast episodes here, wherever you're listening, every Wednesday. They come out early in the morning, and it's a great way to just kind of be thinking about story, maybe when you're in a place where you can't be watching an awesome writing theory YouTube video or even working on your story yourself. But at least the brain is churning, you're still invested in that story, and so when you get to go work on your story, you are excited, motivated, and ready. And hopefully, after a podcast like this, thinking about your story a little bit more intentionally. All that being said, thanks for checking out the podcast, and I'll see you next week.